This stimulus bill, they told us it's going to be spent right away. The money's going to immediately go out. Less than, just over 1/3 of the money has gone out. You can monitor it day by day by day at recovery.org. In fact, there's going to be more money spent under the so-called stimulus between 2011, next year, and 2019 than was spent last year when we were supposedly trying to stimulate the economy. When you try and stimulate something, aren't you trying to give it an immediate shock? You know, some guys get down there suffering a heart attack and you got the paddles nearby and somebody yells clear and they say, oh, this will only take a week or two. You know, that's not what you do when you stimulate the economy. You're supposed to stimulate the economy by going out there and getting it going right away, and this thing didn't. We were told it would create 4 million jobs. The President said that in his statement where he signed the bill, and he said 90% of them are going to be in the private sector. Well, we've lost 2.8 million jobs since this bill was signed. And we're no more going to get 4 million jobs created by the end of this year than the man in the moon, which is when they were projected by the President to be created. In fact, they're not 90% in the private sector. They're mostly government jobs. They stopped saying last year they were going to create them. Then they started saying they're going to save or create, despite the fact no economist knows how you can measure, quote, saving jobs. And then they said they were going to save jobs. And then finally, by the end of the year, they were down to funding jobs. In fact, if you go to recovery.org, that's what they say. Here's the number of jobs that we have funded, 595,623. And if you read the description of them, they're government jobs. And this goes to the heart of the most troubling part of the stimulus package. The belief that somehow or another by taxpayers, working people, people who are earning and striving to make a living, by taxing risk takers and entrepreneurs who are creating the jobs, and we then give that money to, quote, save or, quote, fund people in government. Many of those are pay raises, not just pay, but pay raises to people who are on the government payroll. That is not how you create prosperity. In fact, if you go back, there's a very interesting document. My problem was actually having been in government, read these things and take them halfway serious. But there's a document worth reading that came out on January 10th from the designate of the Council of Economic Advisors, the chairman designate, Christine Romer, which was the intellectual defense of the stimulus bill. And it said in there that for every dollar of expenditure under the proposed stimulus bill, there would be $1.50 in economic growth. Hey, if that's the case, why'd we stop at $787 billion? Let's spend $2 trillion and get $3 trillion of economic growth and pocket the trillion. Let's spend $5 trillion and get $7.5 trillion. I mean, look, I took freshman macroeconomics. You read anybody who writes about the subject, and you'll find there's a consensus that when you take a stimulus measure, even if it's well devised and well defined, you're robbing future growth in order to keep current growth from being deeper than it would otherwise be. So you get roughly for every expenditure, $1 of expenditure, you get roughly 80 cents or less of economic growth. And the hope is that you can pay back that difference, the deficit that you're using to finance it later on. But this bill is not creating economic growth. And again, it's because of the nature of presidential leadership. Outsource it to Congress, talk with Democrats only, and don't pay attention to the details. We then have seen an explosion of spending. And this really troubles me. Look, I get the president's campaign rhetoric may not be exactly the same as what he's governed, but he comes in and proposes not only the $787 billion stimulus bill and a $30 billion increase in the S-CHIP, the State Children's Health Insurance Program, but to me one of the most damaging things was within a month of coming into office, in the middle of the fiscal year, he proposes an 8% increase and signs into law that increase in discretionary non-security domestic spending in the middle of the fiscal year. Then he proposes a budget for FY10 that takes on top of that new baseline, FY09 plus 8% in the middle of the year, he proposes another 12% increase in discretionary domestic spending for the following year, for the fiscal year in which we're in, and gets that budget passed by November. To put it in perspective, the discretionary domestic spending budget of the United States at a time when we're all hurting has grown 25% between February and November of last year. If you trail that out for the balance of this decade, for the balance of the next 10 years, that means the federal government will be spending roughly $1.4 trillion more in discretionary domestic spending than we were projected to spend as of January 19th last year. And that assumes that you flatline discretionary domestic spending increases and only increase them at inflation for the next 10 years. And we made that decision without a lot of controversy or discussion of its implications. Then we had that famous cap and trade bill, which was an energy tax. Let's just be honest about it. Now, first of all, again, the president outsourced it to Congress. Do you remember during the campaign, this was not a surprise. He talked about having a cap and trade bill. But what was interesting was he talked in the campaign about auctioning off all of the permits. This was going to be a source of revenue, and it was a market device. Let the market determine the price of carbon. And when they wrote the bill in the House, what did they do? They gave away 85% or more of the permits. They designated them for the sectors. They said, the government's going to pick winners and losers, and we're going to hand out the permits. So the fundamental core of the Obama approach was not even embodied in the House bill, and we never heard a whimper out of the White House. Nor did we hear an explanation from the White House how they could keep their promise never to tax anybody making less than $250,000 a year and not have a cap and trade tax in there that would tax anybody who flips a light switch, turns a car key, or buys anything manufactured or shipped inside the United States. And most important of all, the bill would end up doing nothing. You can have this gigantic cap and trade and, and limit on CO2 emissions in the United States of America, and its effect upon the global output of CO2 would be negligible. Look, we got an economy 4 times the size of the Chinese economy, and we put out fewer greenhouse gases than they do. Says something about the energy efficiency of the United States, doesn't it? In fact, you know what? In 2006, the last year for which we have numbers, because the United States followed a policy of saying we will use technology to bring about more efficient use of energy, which has as a co-product of that, a byproduct of that, a co-benefit of that, reduced greenhouse gas emissions. In 2006, there was only one major industrialized economy in the world which grew and at the same time reduced the absolute amount of greenhouse gases it put out, the United States of America. And we'd pass a bill that would beggar our economy, tax everybody, act as an incentive not to rely upon hydrocarbons, which we absolutely need for our economic and energy security, and do what? Nothing when it comes to reducing the absolute amount of greenhouse gases worldwide. Negligible impact. China and India in a day, Brazil in a day would put out more than we reduced ourselves by. Problem for you is this. You have a failed stimulus bill in which we've put out a lot of bucks and we don't get much economic growth. We have these hidden spending, these not very clearly seen increases in discretionary domestic spending, which have got $1.4 trillion more now in the next 10 years need for revenue than we had otherwise. You then add on this health care bill where they're going to try and find ways to start patching the holes through which that red ink is coming.